forward, folks. Now, Frank, why study apologetics?
Because not only are we commanded to, I mean, I could give you a passage after passage in the Bible that we ought to defend the faith. I mean, the famous one that many people quote is 1 Peter 3:15, which says, always be ready to give an answer, give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Now, the gentleness and respect thing is hard for me because I'm originally from New Jersey, okay? But we're supposed to give evidence for what we believe. That's number one. But number two, as I mentioned earlier, it just makes reasonable sense. Why should you believe something that isn't true? Why should you devote your life to something that isn't true? In fact, Paul himself said, look, if Christ has arisen from the dead, your faith's in vain. You might as well eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. So it just makes practical sense that you ought to get evidence for what you believe.
Yeah, so I mean, last week we had a former Catholic on, and he told us the best way to minister to Catholics. And you mentioned Muslims earlier. There are similarities, but there are also some distinct differences between those two. Real quick, what is the best way or the best argument we can make when we're evangelizing to Muslims?
Well, first of all, you want to do it privately because they can't lose face in public. Secondly, you need to be aware that if a Muslim leaves Islam, it could be very painful to them, even to the point of death. Surah 3, third chapter in the Quran, basically says anyone who leaves Islam ought to be killed. Okay, so it's a big deal to leave Islam. But I just point out the internal problem that Muslims have from a logical perspective. I'll get to that in a minute, but you might want to also express that in Christianity, other than being true, it's also a way you can guarantee you're going to get eternal life because it's not based on your good works like in Islam, where Allah is arbitrary and he can just decide whether or not to let you in or not. In Christianity, you can be assured you have eternal life because it's not based on the work we do, it's based on the work Jesus has done. All right. But here's the big problem with Islam from their perspective. There's something known as the Quranic dilemma. And if you look at Surah 5 and Surah 4, you can point this out to people. In Surah 5, verse 68, it tells people of the book, Christians and Jews, to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament. It says, oh, you people of the book, you have no ground to stand on unless you stand on the law and the gospel. So essentially, the Quran is saying, obey the Bible, right? The problem is in the chapter before, Surah 4, verse 157, it says that Jesus never even died. He was taken straight to heaven, so he couldn't have resurrected from the dead. Now, here's the dilemma for Muslims. If the Bible is true, then obviously true about Jesus rising from the dead, then obviously the Quran is false. However, if the Bible is false, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead and Christianity is not true, the Quran is still false. Why? Because it's telling people to obey a book that's false. So this is a Quranic dilemma, and Muslims are going to try to say, oh, the Bible's been corrupted. Well, according to their own Quran, it says the Allah's words cannot be abrogated, cannot be changed. So how is the Bible corrupted if the Quran is saying us that the Bible is telling us the Bible's true and Allah's words can't be abrogated? How could it be corrupted? And by the way, we know it's not corrupted because by the time the Quran was written in the 600s AD, we had a complete Bible for over 300 years. We had, the manuscript called Sinaiticus from Mount Sinai. So the idea that Muslims can say the Bible's been corrupted just doesn't work. It doesn't work from their own theology, and it doesn't work from the facts that we had the Bible long before Muhammad ever showed up, and it wasn't corrupted then.